I recently saw a video of a dude named Elon Dux talking about sending Tom Cruise to space in order to film a movie about aliens or some shit. Legend has it, Mr. Dux got bored working on spaceships, so he hopped into his Tesla, lit up a fat doobie, and began orbiting the planet when he asked himself this question. What's the weirdest thing I could do with all this money I have? Something that will have people say, wow, Elon Quacks is the smartest, most brilliant bird to have ever lived. He thought for days on end and finally came up with an idea. He wanted to connect brains to computers. Now I know what you're thinking. Didn't he see The Matrix? Didn't he see Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind? Didn't he see any sci-fi movie where people connect their brains to computers? Something bad always happens. So why would anyone, for any reason, support this nonsense? Well, Ewok Moose is not a normal guy. He didn't watch any of those movies and decided to throw a bunch of cash at making his cyber-human wet dream possible. So say hello to Neuralink, a company that wants to connect human brains to computers en masse by implanting tiny little electrically sensitive threads into your squishy brain tissue so you can send text messages and play video games just by thinking. While some elements of the Neuralink are pretty revolutionary, this idea is actually not new. Humans have been using brainwaves to control computers since the 90s, and the theoretical groundwork for this technology has been in development for at least 100 years, way before genius Big Boy Duck stopped pooping his pants. And in many of the instances where scientists have successfully connected brains to computers, there have been stories of triumph from people who live under some of the most debilitating neurological conditions known to humanity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What's this movie about? What's this video about? It's not a movie, Jesus Christ. It has 3 parts. The first is the basics of how brain-machine interfaces work, or BMI for short. The second is how we go from 2020, where this technology is in its baby state, to 2100, where I believe these technologies will be just as commonplace as smartphones. Zoom. And the third part is how BMIs will be used by artists and future musicians to create some really sick-ass, dope-ass art and music. So grab some snacks, crack open a can of LaCroix, and snuggle up by the fire because we're about to dive deep into the future of brain-machine interface technology in our very first and possibly last episode of Brainz. It's the year 2100. You roll into a cutting-edge facility on your hoverboard wearing nanotech clothing and an augmented reality headset. You sit down in a chair and a robot walks over to you and says,
"Greetings! What would you like to have installed today?"
A motor cortex implant, you say.
"A fine choice, sir."
After you fill out some digital waivers, Robo brings over a machine that looks like one of Doc Ock's arms from Spider-Man and positions it over your head. It then presses a button and the machine applies some local anesthetic to your skull. It then drills a small hole and begins to implant thousands of tiny wires into the soft tissues of your brain that are smaller than a single thread of hair. Once the procedure is done, the robot says,
"Excellent! Now it's time to calibrate, my good sir."
A screen boots up in your augmented reality headset with a cursor in the middle. Robo says,
"Imagine you are moving your index finger upwards, but don't actually move your index finger, just pretend to do so."
You imagine moving your finger up, and the cursor on the screen moves up.
Good! Now down.
Again, you imagine it, and the cursor on the screen moves down.
Excellent!
the robot says.
You are now calibrated. It might take a few weeks to get the hang of it, but you may now be on your way.
That sounds pretty far-fetched, right? Well, scientists have already done something like this in a number of real living human beings. So how does it work? Your brain is made up of a bunch of tiny units of life called cells. Some of these cells are called neurons, and they look like this. Here's a cartoon version of a single neuron. There are about 100 billion neurons that make up your brain and spinal cord, and their primary function is to send signals to each other. And these signals code information. For instance, cells in the back of your brain code visual information. So if I were to whack you in the back of the head with a hammer, you could go blind. Different brain regions constantly interact with each other to give rise to every aspect of human behavior. From pooping to partying, breathing to hearting. When you pet alley cats, eat jazzy snacks, smoke cigarettes while coughing in the rain, you're using your big old brain. And it does all of this through a deceptively simple process on a scale that we are only just beginning to understand. Let's dive even deeper. Neurons communicate through electrochemical signals. All this means is that neurons use both electricity and chemicals to talk to each other. A neuron has an internal electric charge of -70 millivolts at rest. This is when it's just chilling out, doing nothing. But once the charge reaches a very special number, the cell goes crazy and it shoots a bolt of electricity down this tube thing called an axon, where it then poops out some chemicals, and these chemicals then are released on the surface of another cell. And that's what changes the charge of that subsequent cell. Is that a little confusing still? Let's use an analogy. Now just imagine you are holding a gun in your hand. Now with a gun, if you pull the trigger just ever so slightly, nothing happens. Pull it a little more, nothing happens. But there's a point at which a threshold is reached and the gun goes. Now pretend that there are 5 folks behind me with guns and there's one dude in front of me with a gun. And now let's also just say that the 5 dudes behind me like to shoot me in the butt kind of at random. Each time one shoots me, I pull the trigger on my gun just a little more tightly. Ooh. Ooh. Ah. Ooh. Ah. Because they are not shooting all at the same time, the pain never gets to a point of me pulling the trigger all the way, i.e., it never reaches the threshold potential. But when all 5 shoot me in the butt at the same time, I clench my finger on the trigger to the point where the gun fires, and I shoot the dude in front of me in the butt. Ooh. Oh. Ooh. This is kind of how your cells work. A bunch of tiny little neurons shooting molecules out of their synapses at neurons in front of them, which then changes how likely that neuron is to shoot the ones in front of it. And this whole cycle is what people mean when they say neurons firing. And this happens super fast, all of the time, all over the brain, in a vastly interconnected system of over 100 billion. Maybe you're feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. This stuff is pretty wild. Just take a little breather, sip your LaCroix, and munch on that sweet melon, because there's a whole lot more big brain material to go through. There is a natural asynchronous rhythm to a healthy brain. All this means is that different parts of the brain fire at different rates depending on what's happening. So maybe neurons in the back of your brain are firing at 4 times per second, indicating that you're seeing a melon. And then there are neurons in the middle of your brain firing at an average of 80 times per second, indicating that you're tasting a melon. The speed of these firings changes as you do or experience things. For instance, the part of your brain that sends a signal to your hand to move might be firing at this rate when you do nothing, and at this rate when it sends a signal for your hand to move. Remember when we asked for a motor cortex implant from Robo Dude? The motor cortex is a strip of the brain that can be seen here, and it's involved in telling certain parts of the body what to do. I'm talking hands, I'm talking feet, I'm talking mouth, and I'm talking ass. Even when you just think about picking up a can of Steve Irwin's unofficial sparkling water, there are cells that change how fast they fire in preparation for you to do so. So scientists put sensors on these regions to collect the electrical signals involved in sending this information to your hands, for instance, and use these firing patterns to manipulate various elements of a computer or machine. Here's the first patient ever to use this kind of technology to write a full letter to the very scientists who implanted the device. This was back in the 90s. Over time, this technology has advanced to a point where fully paralyzed people can paint paintings and pluck notes on a digital piano. There are also non-invasive ways people are sending brain signals to machines, using a thing known as an electroencephalogram, or EEG for short. Instead of plugging directly into brain tissue, you can stick pieces of metal on your head and read the electrical activity going on underneath the surface of the skull. People have used this for controlling prosthetic limbs, moving balls and objects, and in the case of Angie Combes, sending signals to the famous modular synthesizer Tonto. There are benefits and drawbacks to these two methods of reading brain signals. With the EEG, you can move it around and take it off, but at least for now, the accuracy and speed is still pretty limited. Angie wasn't controlling Tonto with the same degree as our piano-playing friend. However, with implants, you need surgery or other far-out invasive procedures. Right now, both of these technologies are slow and imprecise, but advances are being made by the day. And it's not unreasonable to assume that the speed and accuracy of information transmission is only going to get faster in time. It's just how it goes. Now you know what's currently possible. But the title of the video is about the future. So you're probably wondering, how do we go from a few disabled and eccentric folks using this technology to it being so common that nearly everyone in society uses these devices for a range of activities, including making art and music? Well, this means we're at part 2 of the video. In order for this technology to become a thing, like a big thing, consumers need to see that the benefits outweigh the costs to a point where they would be willing to buy a wearable brain headset or go through a procedure to get one implanted. There are many factors that go into a cost-benefit analysis, and for this technology, I think that there are 5 super important hurdles to overcome in order for society to adopt this tech en masse. So now let's play 5 super important hurdles to overcome in order for society to adopt this technology en masse. The first category is safety. The second is financial. The third is use value. The fourth is stigma. And the fifth and final category is, will nefarious corporations or hackers use this technology to control my mind against my own will? And now we have our contestants. Little Travis.
Hi, Mom.
Cool Travis.
What's up?
And of course, Future Travis. Okay, Little Travis, you pick first.
Ooh, I'll take safety for 500, please.
Okay, safety for 500. So the topic of safety is obviously a really important one. And the short of it is, it just takes time. For EEG headsets, I'm not too worried. They're non-invasive and have been used for many, many years with few issues. But with implants, on the other hand, there are way more things that could go wrong. Infection, leaky brain fluid, unintended neuronal death, signal pathway disruption, addiction, and the list goes on. But people have been using other kinds of implants with great success for a really long time. Whether it's pacemakers that can modify your heart rate through Wi-Fi, breast and booty enhancements for a more voluptuous look, or cochlear implants for hearing. The challenges that arise with these modifications, for the most part, have been solved. Moreover, there are already deep brain implants being used to treat Parkinson's disease and seizures, so researchers have a head start in risk mitigation for this specific kind of technology already. So I'd mark this problem as solvable. Next! I'll take cost for 300. Emotive, a company that sells EEG headsets to the public, has a listed price for an entry-level brain interface at around 300 bucks, and a more powerful one coming in at 850 bucks. And Elon Musk has said that the initial cost of the Neuralink would be pretty high. So I can't assume that the average person would spend upwards of potentially a couple grand a year to get this service and this technology, especially if it's in its early stages. But tech tends to get cheaper over time. The first HD TVs to hit the market back in 1998 cost about 7 grand. And I just saw a Black Friday sale yesterday for a 4K 55-inch TV with a price tag of 148 bones. So again, cost, if development keeps occurring, won't be an issue. Problem solvable. Next! The big thing here is bandwidth, or the speed at which we can send info back and forth from computers to our brains. Thus, any activity you can think of that interfaces with a computer, which is a lot of stuff, could be more fluid and efficient with these devices. So let's just leave this one here for now. Tiny Travis, yes.
Stigma for 300.
Right now, 69% of Americans say that they are worried or very worried about implanting computer chips into their brain, oftentimes calling upon religious or spiritual reasons, such as changing God's plan or disrupting nature. There are also pretty non-religious critiques as well, such as fear of government or corporate manipulation and control.
Pop chips. Pop chips.
So the question then becomes, how do we go from the sex number of people saying that they're worried about this technology to a majority of people using these devices in their everyday life? Enter the diffusion of innovation model. Diffusion of innovation is a way to think about how ideas and fresh, hot technology spread throughout a society, going from just a few folks to many, many folks. Let's use smartphones as an example. With the typical model, there are innovators who are at the forefront of creating a technology. This would be Steve Jobs and his development team at Apple back in the early 2000s. Early adopters come next, and they were some of the first to buy the iPhone, inspired by its novelty and scarcity, and they make up a slightly larger piece of the pie. So that tech kid you knew from high school who always needed the newest flashy piece of gear would likely be an early adopter. Over time, the early majority jumps on board after seeing the benefits that the tech kid had using the iPhone. I was a little reluctant to get on the smartphone choo-choo train, and I didn't get one until here. And this is known as the late majority. And finally, the last category are laggards. For laggards, it's likely that social pressure was a greater motivator to getting an iPhone. As you can see, there are a bunch of things that influence whether or not people will adopt new technology, including how old they are, how much money they make, and how close they are to the developers who make it. For non-invasive neurotech, stuff that you can just wear like a hat, a la the emotive headset, the motivations and diffusion patterns will roughly match that of the iPhone and other more traditional tech. But for something like a brain implant that Elon Musk is working on, the order of people who populate the curve will be a little bit different because, let's just face it, buying a tiny computer to put in your pocket is very different from drilling a hole into your skull and implanting a device permanently. So how will the early, mid, and late adopters of implants differ from that of the early, mid, and late adopters of the iPhone? Or in other words, how will these technologies lose their stigma? To my knowledge, all neural implants to date have been for medical reasons. This is largely due to the fact that these technologies are being designed with very specific people in mind, namely paralyzed people, or people with what is known as locked-in syndrome, which is when you can't move your entire body, but you are still fully conscious and alive. These are some of the most difficult brain disorders one could have. I mean, just imagine, you have to lie in bed all day with no ability to do literally anything except maybe communicate yes-no signals through eye movements. Like, that's tough. And as you could guess, these people have more incentive than able-bodied individuals to get this technology. Once the efficacy and safety is thoroughly demonstrated in this population through many, many rounds of research, it can then be put into people who are disabled to less of a degree. The typical time period for a biomedical treatment to go from early experimentation to broad availability is around 17 years, give or take. However, neural implant technology is still very much a toddler, and I see 17 years as an ambitious estimate. My ballpark guess would be that in the next 25 to 30 years, these devices will become broadly available for medical purposes in the same way that psychotropic drugs are now available to treat a range of disorders. This would be just about the time when people my age will be experiencing cognitive and physical decline. Thus, I think older millennials will be early adopters for this tech. If the medical effectiveness can be shown on a broad scale, we could start to see a transition into normalizing these devices for non-medical purposes. In other words, if my 75-year-old grandmother gets an implant for typing in order to bypass her debilitating arthritis, maybe the company that makes the interface will allow third-party developers to create protocols for the implant so that instead of just typing, she can now play Halo or use Photoshop just by sending mental commands to her computer. And her grandchildren will see this as a normal state of affairs. And poof, stigma, bye-bye. Cool, Travis, yeah. I'll take corporate or governmental control for 900. There is no 900. That category just doesn't exist. The early internet went through a golden age where it was rare for corporate interests to use data collection tactics to manipulate you and me into doing their bidding. The beginning of the transition from medical to recreational use of these devices will likely experience a similar golden age, where there will be minimal corporate manipulation occurring because this tech will largely still be under the umbrella of medical devices. But once the recreational market breaks open, two things will happen. The first is that society will take one of its largest steps towards transhumanism or integration with machines. And the second is that corporations will begin to have greater incentive to influence the devices and software made for these devices in ways that maximize profit at the expense of individual thriving. If we're smart and elect officials who aren't f***ing dumbasses about this stuff, regulations could be put into place regarding the limits of corporate data collection and use. Regardless of the outcomes at the policy end, I think that this revolution is coming, barring any major economic or environmental catastrophe that would disrupt research and development. To many watching, this might still seem pretty far-fetched and even a little bit horrifying. So before I get to the final part of the video, the art and the music stuff that like the whole title is about and that I haven't even talked about yet, and it's like 2/3 of the way through the video already and I haven't said anything about it. I just want to make sure that we're clear on what I think will actually be possible in the near future and what is not possible, at least anytime soon. For starters, no, it will not be able to read your darkest thoughts and send them out into the world. While this in theory is possible to do, the direction the technology is going now seems only to be targeting consciously controllable systems. In other words, it will only send signals out into the world that you intend to send. Think of the initial headsets and implants more like a hyper-fast keyboard and mouse combo than a subconscious mind-reading device. No, you will not immediately become a super genius or a creative icon. There will still be a learning curve for this stuff, and you will likely suck a lot at first. But over time, you will get to a point where using this device will become a breeze, giving you more speed and fidelity than your hands could even dream of. Hacking would probably be rare, and if we're going to think about the worst case scenario, it might be possible for a hacker to send signals to your brain which start to make your hand or face twitch or elicit unwanted sound or visual sensations. But with an EEG headset, you could just take it off, and for something like the Neuralink, you could just turn Bluetooth off on your phone. Again, this would be very rare, and hopefully there will be many other security systems in place to prevent this. Finally, the need for creativity won't just go away. While you will have more tools at your disposal to make art, it doesn't mean that it will automatically render creative expression irrelevant. Just like when Photoshop or Ableton was invented, it didn't make everyone who used it top-tier creators, and there will still be differing levels of skill and styles that will come out of these devices. So this shouldn't seem to be like the death of creativity. Okay, I think those are the big problems people usually have with it. Now let's finish this damn video. Part 3! So now we're here, 2100, where this technology is everywhere. Corporate boardrooms, stock markets, shipping facilities, construction sites, and doctors' offices. But what will artists, in the most general sense, be doing with it? There are many ways it could go, whether it be visual artists, crafting paintings with their minds using high-speed, hyper-precise brushstrokes on a traditional or digital canvas, to live musicians modifying multiple parameters on synthesizers and electronic DAWs just by thinking, freeing up their hands to play instruments or engage with other elements of the process in ways that were never possible before. Poets and writers of the future would be able to craft novels and articles hands-free at speeds unheard of due to the minimal delay between thought and expression. And photographers could link up camera parameters to their brain to have hyper-precise manual focusing, changing the ISO and shutter speeds all in a fully intentional flash. These are just a few of the more vanilla things that could be done. With the technology of the future, augmented and virtual reality environments could be created and modulated in real time using neural headsets, with people influencing elements of physics, lighting, and sound within a space just by thinking it. Gaming could take on all new forms with high-intensity neural-assisted aim or a completely neural-controlled action that might not otherwise be possible using a controller or mouse and keyboard. Even more far out would be the possibility of interfacing with artificial intelligence. Imagine jamming out with a digital organism that listens to the sounds you're making along with the signals coming from your brain and produces intelligent and meaningful drum, keyboard, or vocal responses catered to your playing style and overall vibes. There's already AI software that can create music based on songs you feed into it. So the initial step for this kind of technology has already been taken. While jamming with AI is pretty wild, what would it be like to jam with your own brain? This honestly, like, video aside, this might be one of the craziest things that I've heard all year. Some dude named Guy Benary surgically removed cells from his wrist, reverted those cells back into stem cells, which are just like baby cells, and then grew a tiny brain out of those cells and then hooked up those cells to a synthesizer. His buddy then got on the drums and had a jam session with that brain, which listened to his drum playing and would respond with sounds in real time. If folks are doing this now, you can only just begin to imagine what could be possible in the future. And it's not all about making art. It's also possible to enhance the experience on the consumer end. For instance, if you were to stimulate the right cells in the auditory or visual cortex, you could enhance the richness of sounds or visuals presented to a person, or even create sounds and visuals that feel more real than life itself. Imagine walking around in a fully realized, enchanted forest, or a city in the clouds, with the same vividness as some of your most wild dreams. You wouldn't be limited to just the visual and auditory cortex either. You could also stimulate the somatosensory cortex, the part of the brain that codes for one's sense of touch. New forms of art might emerge where you could download tactile experiences that other artists have created that would generate sensations in ways that are not possible from traditional touch. Like maybe an artist wants you to feel what it's like to be inside of a big tub of warm liquid fluff, or experience the sensation of 1,000 tiny dogs licking you all at once. This could also be used for providing feedback in virtual environments, like when your hand touches a rock or when you step into a puddle during a rainstorm. Okay, that's all pretty wild. But I'm not naive in thinking that the future is only going to be super chill and groovy with this technology. There is absolutely a warranted fear. Fear of losing our humanity or being controlled by nefarious actors. And I get that fear, I really do. However, I do think it might be equally naive to completely ignore the potential of this tech to transform many areas of human expression in ways that will be truly amazing. These devices, born out of medical necessity, could give rise to a revolution in artistic expression that rivals that of the computer and internet. The safety, cost, and ethics are issues we will be grappling with for years to come. And now that we see what kind of world is possible, these concerns should be at the forefront of the discussion so that we can minimize dystopia and create a future that maximizes thriving for all. Okay, come on in, brother.